We have a praise and worship like none other. Can somebody testify?
Say, oh Lord.
Our speakers are totally awesome.
Realize that if I'm going to be who I'm going to be, I've got to put work in where nobody's looking.
Someone tell me, at what point was sin registered to her account?
If you have come looking for a rich enhancement, a spiritual blessing, you have come to the right place. This is a place where praise is uninhibited. Matter of fact, we want it here. All of it is here. And matter of fact, this is a place where you will find support. This is a place where you're going to find that if you've never known God, I guarantee you by the time you leave this weekend, you will know him for the first time or even better.
At the end of the day, what we have to realize is that more than the likes and more than the approval of men is I want God to be able to look at me and say, well done. Well done, good and faithful. I want him to be able to look at me and say, listen, you are being true and honest to who you are, that you are a man of integrity, that you are a woman of virtue, and that you are living an upright and moral life.
But I believe that what we're establishing this weekend is the opportunity to come clean with all of our stuff. We're all coming out, right? We're all coming out of the things that identified us, that defined us, that we thought was who we are, but God said that you're something more. He calls us princes and princesses, and that we're royalty when we accept Jesus.
Good evening, and welcome to another Pure Reality session forum that we're having. For those of you that have joined us over the last 10 months, you've recognized that we have been dealing with some very critical issues as far as social justice issues. We've dealt with mental health, and today we're dealing with a very important topic, and it's going to be on modern-day slavery, human trafficking. We have a great lineup for you this evening. Expert on the topic, and we will have our moderator who will be introducing him a little later in the program. But before we get started, we're going to have opening prayer, and Chriselle Griffin will give us opening prayer.
For those of you that are online with us, we just want you to stop for a moment. We just want you to take this time to think about a lot of the things that are just taking over our lives. We know that this evening we're going to be talking about human trafficking, the movement of a person or the trading of human life. But we just want to go ahead and talk to God for a moment. So wherever you are, as you're watching us online, we ask that you just bow your head for just a moment so that we can pray about this topic and also the lives of and the families that this affects. Dear God, we just want to thank you so much just for allowing us to be able to have breath, to be in this space, to be in this world, to be in this moment. We pray for these individuals that are experiencing this type of human slavery. God, we know that we are not able to own anything or anyone, that you are the owner, the author, the originator of our lives. And we pray that those that have experienced it, that they will not just be victims of this crime, but that they will become victorious so that they can testify how good you've been to them in their lives. We also pray for the moderator that is going to bring us a message, give us the information to protect us, to protect our family members, and hopefully give us the wisdom that we need in order to fight against these type of injustices within our society. We want to thank everyone that is online right now, and we want to pray for their families, their friends, their neighbors, everyone that is in their circle, dear Father, that they will also be protected. You've given us so much. You've given us your Son to die on the cross. You've given us salvation. So God, we pray that anyone that is listening to the sound of our voice, can also hear your message through us. In Jesus' name, we do pray. Amen.
And just before we get started, I would like to introduce to you our moderator for the afternoon for this evening. His name is Jay Rolle. He's no stranger to any of our Pure Reality team, and for those of you that have visited on our Pure Reality retreats, he is definitely one of our great hosts that help make Pure Reality a very special experience. So we're pretty blessed today to have him moderate our program. He is a motivational speaker. He is also a counselor for drug and alcohol abuse. He deals with at-risk youth and young adults alike. And we're just happy that he's here with us today. So at this time, we're going to go ahead and turn the program over to him, and he will introduce our special presenter for the evening. Please stay tuned. You will have an opportunity to participate at some point in the program today. As you know, this is a virtual program, so you'll actually be able to communicate with us through YouTube as well as Facebook. If you have any questions after the program, please send it through those mediums, and we'll be more than happy to forward those questions off to our moderator. At this time, we turn the program over to Jay Rolle.
As it is. Today, it's estimated that about 40+ million people globally are in slavery, and that is more than ever before in human history. Traffickers prey on adults and children of all ages, race, gender, ethnic groups and nationalities, socioeconomic backgrounds, immigration status, educational level. They're exploited for profit. In fact, right now, 29% of those victims are men and boys. And globally, India is at the top of the list with about 14 million victims. Coming in next is China, that has about 3.2 million victims. Third is Pakistan, that has 2.1 million victims. And Cambodia is also a destination country for trafficking. 36% of trafficked human beings are victims are Asian and are children, while 64% are adults. In the United States, it is estimated that 14,500 to 17,500 foreign nationals are trafficked in the U.S. into the U.S. every year. The Justice Department at this time says that there possibly could be about 200,000 people that meet that status with slavery. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry that generates about $150 billion per year. This is more profitable than the drug industry. And 1 in 4 victims of human trafficking are children that are forced into slave labor. We have a presenter today that is wise and that is well versed in these areas, and we are going to hear a lot from him as we have things coming up. But one of the things that we would like to do now is thank him for being here on the part of the Albert C. Pierre Community Center and Pure Reality Mentorship Program. And we want to thank him for accepting the invitation and sharing his knowledge of modern day slavery of human trafficking. So thank you so much. And let me give you a little background on Dr. Richard Schoeberl. Right now, he has had 25 years of law experience that includes the FBI and the National Counterterrorism Center. He has served in a variety of positions throughout his career, ranging from the supervisory special agent at the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., to unit chief of the International Terrorism Operations Sections at the NCTC headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Before these assignments, he worked as a special agent investigating violent crimes, human trafficking, international terrorism, and organized crime. He was assigned to numerous collateral duties during his FBI tour, including a certified instructor and member of the agency's SWAT program. Dr. Richard also is currently serving as a U.S. team leader for Hope for Justice, a global nonprofit combating human trafficking. He is also professor of criminology and homeland security at Martin Methodist College. Located on 5 continents, Hope for Justice works to bring in an end to modern slavery by preventing exploitation, recruiting victims, restoring lives, and reforming society. Dr. Richard manages the U.S. programs entities, which includes training, investigation initiatives, and community outreach. He further serves as a special consultant for law enforcement teams handling trafficking cases, as well as conducting investigation and coordination with law enforcement agencies. Additionally, he develops and delivers special human trafficking training to the U.S. government, law enforcement agencies, healthcare, and financial institutions, just to name a few. Dr. Richard S. is also a media contributor for Fox News, CNN, PBS, NPR, and several others. He also has authored several journals and is a peer mentor with the Police Executive Research Forum. It is indeed an honor and privilege to have this gentleman with us today. And Doc, we know that you're going to bring us a lot of knowledge and wealth of information, but I believe at this time we have a clip to show that will give a background history of where we're going and how he's involved and how we can ask questions that will be dealing with this topic. So at this time, I'll let the technicians go forward.
Slavery, a term that conjures images of some of the darkest practices in human history, stripping a human being of their freedom and their dignity in the name of greed and profit.
People don't feel that slavery actually still exists. However, we know differently that people are being forced to do unspeakable acts for profit. It's plain to see that slavery hasn't ended. It's just evolved into something completely different.
Right now, it's estimated that there are over 40 million victims of modern-day slavery. 1 in every 4 victims are children. Whether it's domestic servitude, forced labor, or sexual exploitation, traffickers treat people like commodities and transport them all over the world to be used or to be sold for profit.
Many of the girls have been trafficked into brothels, into commercial sex work. But recently we had 3 little siblings, ages 5, 7 and 8, were actually sold to a couple of older women who used them then in a big city to engage in forced begging. And they would push these small children out amongst traffic, in the market to try and beg for money. Women who were looking after them, I might say, were really just giving them a little bit of rice and barely enough to exist on.
It's clear that slavery affects the lives of millions across the world, and it needs to be eradicated. So, in 2008, a team of people founded Hope for Justice to do just that.
We can't stop at raising awareness. We must actually set people free. We must rescue trafficked victims. We must get to grips with this problem of slavery.
Hope for Justice has built a professional and transformational response to the issue of modern-day slavery. Wherever slavery exists, Hope for Justice is committed to ending it once and for all. And this is how we are doing it. One of the most effective ways to eradicate modern slavery is through prevention. Through community-led programs, we equip and empower the most vulnerable so they can protect themselves and their families against the traffickers.
And we are proud to say that the children themselves are part and parcel of this process. We also hold community dialogue, where the community comes in and we talk about these issues and find community-owned solutions on how to prevent human trafficking. How do we stop abuse and exploitation within our own community? We let the community lead.
Specialist teams identify victims of sex trafficking, forced labor, and domestic servitude through investigative and community outreach work. We work alongside the police and other agencies to build bridges of trust that help people find their freedom and get them the support they need.
Rescue isn't an event, it's a process. It's where rebuilding lives begins, and our third strategy comes into effect: restore. For children, we have aftercare facilities where we provide trauma-informed care for immediate crisis interventions. For adults, we provide holistic support and individual advocacy tailored to the individual and their needs. We support survivors to access their legal rights and entitlements, overcome barriers, and navigate complex systems. We stand alongside survivors of human trafficking as they walk the path to freedom and independence.
The final stage to abolishing slavery for good in our world depends on the world around us. Reforming society to actively fight against those who wish to exploit others and protect those who are vulnerable to traffickers.
We are meeting with government entities all around the world to help nations improve their legislation surrounding modern slavery and exploitation. Not only that, we also established Slave Free Alliance. Slave Free Alliance works with businesses to uncover and quickly resolve potential exploitation occurring in their supply chains. As for the rest of society, Hope for Justice continues to raise awareness and train people to spot the signs of modern slavery. As well as training, we utilize social media platforms to inform the public and empower them to make a difference in their communities.
With all these proven strategies working together, we will see the end to this tragedy. We will continue to see parents reunited with their loved ones, children given the right to grow up in a safe and nurturing environment, and men and women restored to have hope for their future. Our team here at Hope for Justice are changing lives every day. Our advocates and social workers use the wealth of experience to guide our survivors along every step of their journey towards restoration. Our trainers and program staff spend time directly engaging with communities to make a real difference. Our partnerships and communications teams who constantly innovate and refine the way in which we engage and inform our wider society. Every single one of them working together to see a world free from modern day slavery and put human trafficking in the history books where it belongs.
Video. Great intro to lead into our question period now with Dr. Richard. Matter of fact, Dr. Richard, I hope it's okay to call you that, or if not, just let me know the title I should use for you.
It's perfectly fine. I know my last name is not Smith. It's not easy. So that's perfect.
Thank you so much, my friend. I'm from Opelika and I was struggling, but I will try to get it before the show is over. Thank you so much. Once again, great to have you. And I want to lead off with this question because most people look at human trafficking as sex trafficking. But from what I'm understanding, there's 6 different types of human trafficking. Can you explain the difference between these different types of trafficking?
Certainly. You know, here in the United States, a lot of times we have the misconception that, or we just think about trafficking as sex and that's it. But we often neglect to realize that there are, thousands of people who are indentured slaves in the labor market. So we also look at labor trafficking. Another one of the areas that we look at too is domestic servitude. Domestic servitude would be somebody coming to the United States or somebody currently living in the United States that works as maybe a nanny or a house cleaner. And that type of crime is extremely clandestine and very difficult to detect because a lot of times the trafficker doesn't allow this person to communicate or go outside most often. So law enforcement and nonprofits, you just can't go to everybody's door and knock on it and say, hey, excuse me, do you happen to have a slave in here? That's just typically not the case. So that's difficult. And another one that we look at here in the United States too is these organized criminal networks, such as magazine sales, individuals that would lure these people into the false promise that they were going to make a lot of money doing this and then not pay them what they deserve to work in there. Fortunately for us, one of the ones that we don't see here in the United States that is much more common abroad we would think would be organ harvesting. Organ harvesting would actually be nurturing somebody in order to sell one of their organs. We see a lot of this happening overseas, not so much of it here in the United States. Not saying it doesn't exist. It's one of the ones that's probably on the lower end. And then also too, we see what we call forced marriage or arranged marriage. And we tend to see this in the communities that in the United States that might mass immigrate into the United States from other countries where forced marriage is more acceptable and it's a normal form or normal practice that may take place in their culture, but not so much here in the United States.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I know you have a great presentation for us now, so I'll back off and I'll let you get into your presentation and we'll have more questions later.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to share my screen for those of you who are joining us, and you'll be able to see my PowerPoint that is that I'll kind of walk you through. So my video will be gone, but you'll. So obviously you already saw the video as to who Hope for Justice is, what we try to do across the globe. As you can see, this is where the countries that we are present in. We're expanding rapidly within the United States currently. When we look at human trafficking, I want to make sure everybody understands the definition or the true definition of it, because what we're looking at really, and this is the technical legal definition, is compelling someone to engage in either commercial sex acts or forced labor through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Now, when we talk about force, fraud, and coercion, we'll elaborate a little bit on that a little bit later through this presentation, but know that force, fraud, and coercion can act independently of one another. So in order for someone to be trafficked, you don't necessarily have to force, fraud, and coerce them. It could just be one of the three. But people are being sold and traded for labor and sex. And we're starting to see this on the rise. We're not seeing a decline in this. We're starting to see this rapidly increase. Victims of human trafficking are exploited, we know, for sex and for labor. Traffickers will use many different techniques to lure these individuals, but they control them, namely by force, right? The key common factor, or what we would call the common denominator for this, is not color of skin. It's not male or female. It's not anything other than vulnerability, okay? Vulnerability. Traffickers exploit those that they think are of the utmost vulnerable. So earlier, Jay, you had talked about some statistics, and I'll throw some of these up here just so you can see that 25 million people in the world are victims of human trafficking. 5 million of those are sexually exploited. Almost 4 million of those are children. And you mentioned one key thing, Jay, is it's 150 billion with a B, $1 billion a year business. So why is this one of the fastest growing crimes right behind drug trafficking? Because you can only sell that kid, that woman, that male. You can only sell that person once. I mean, you can only sell that drug once, but you can sell that person over and over and over again. They are a reusable commodity. So we're starting to see individuals being sold at a rate much faster than we are seeing the drug market go. So those of you who might be joining from somewhere else outside of the Florida region, this kind of gives you just kind of a look at a snapshot at the numbers of where you might fall within the United States. As you can see, Florida is third behind Texas and California. As you can see, the East Coast is heavily. These numbers are numbers taken from Polaris, the National Human Trafficking Hotline. These numbers are how each one of these states rank in accordance with the reports of human trafficking that takes place in those states. So an upward of 80% of trafficking victims are female. So when we talk about trafficking, we talk about girls and young women and females. It's not that men aren't trafficked. It's just that a greater proportion of them are females. A lot of things feed what we call the trafficking funnel. And we know that runaways are extremely high risk for being sex trafficked because we know almost 40% of runaways have traded sex for a place to stay. They resort to what we call survival sex, and they're looking for a way for shelter, food, clothing. And with 1.6 to 2.8 million runaways, and females are representing almost 60% of those, that number is pretty high. We know that an upward of 40% of homeless people have been trafficked. A recent study also revealed, too, that almost 90% of human trafficking victims have been in contact with a healthcare provider at some point while they were being trafficked. Almost 90%. So think about the last time you went to your healthcare provider or went to the emergency room, how much time that you were being cared for while you were there. Most of the time, those facilities are so busy. They're rotating people in and out, particularly now during a time during COVID. A lot of these victims certainly go unidentified, particularly for many reasons is they won't even be able to have an opportunity to visit with them, to see them, to talk to them. A lot of them are wearing masks. You can't see their facial expressions and so forth. So we know that by educating those sectors where human trafficking victims intersect is extremely important, because by raising the level of awareness, we can raise the level of identification of victims. And then by identifying these victims, we can ultimately rescue them. Most juvenile victims have been through the juvenile court system, but we've typically viewed them as teen prostitutes. Well, the problem is according to the law, you can't be a teen prostitute, because anyone under the age of 18, it's called trafficking. Because if you're under the age of 18, you can't give consent to be a prostitute because you're a juvenile. We know that an upwards of 300,000 children are prostituted in the United States. And these victims are getting younger and younger. So for the commercial sex trade for females, we know that it's roughly between the ages of 12 and 14. And for boys, it's even much younger, 11 to 13. So we look at this now as almost like it's a perfect storm, because, with COVID interfering with our day-to-day lives, think about what it does for the victimization of individuals. Trafficking cases are up 185% from last year alone. 1 in 5 kids, think about this, 1 in 5 kids are propositioned online through gaming apps and social media. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children said that there's been a 90% increase in their reports that they've received for online enticement, particularly as we see abundance of these smartphone apps that are allowing people to do things through, live and live streaming it. So when we talked about victims of human trafficking, and Jay and I talked about this a few minutes ago at the beginning of this, that what we typically see here in the United States predominantly are forced labor, sexual exploitation, and domestic servitude. Those are our top 3 that we see here in the U.S. and the ones that happen quite a bit. So we know that the media kind of, sensationalizes human trafficking. And a lot of people, when they think about human trafficking, they automatically gravitate to Liam Neeson in the movie Taken. And yes, people are abducted as trafficking victims, but it's the rarest form that feeds the trafficking funnel. So we know that it does happen, but it's the rarest form. So we want to make sure that everybody understands how it really happens. So think about this, and I'm gonna pause, and you can think about the answer in your head. When we talk about myth or fact, human trafficking involves the transportation of a victim from one place to the other. So think about that just for a second, what your answer would be. It's a myth. Transportation is not a requirement for somebody. You can be trafficked in the same city that you grew up in. You can be trafficked anywhere. The majority of human trafficking victims are women and girls. Myth or fact? Fact. Women and children are affected by modern day slavery at a much higher rate, okay, than males or boys, at 71%. Any minor engaged in commercial sex is a victim of human trafficking. Fact. Children are under the age of 18 are unable to give consent. So if a child is involved in prostitution or commercial sex in any way whatsoever, then it is considered human trafficking by law. If they get paid, they are not victims. So think about this one. If they get paid, they are not victims. Myth. Victimization can come in many forms. A lot of times these individuals are paid a certain amount of money, particularly when we look at labor trafficking, but they're not paid what they deserve, but they'll take the money anyway because it's a job. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the factors that feed that labor trafficking. But just because they are getting paid does not make them not a victim. Smuggling people across the border from Mexico or any country for that matter into the United States is a form of human trafficking. Myth or fact? Smuggling someone across the border is a form of human trafficking. Myth. Human trafficking and human smuggling are two different things. Human trafficking is exploitation based, and human smuggling is voluntary. So when we look at the differences between trafficking and smuggling, no one has ever raised their hand and said, "Hey, will you please traffic me?" But there have been thousands of people who raise their hand and say, "Will you please smuggle me?" They get pushed to another country for a reason, whether they've got violence or poverty in their country, and they're pulled here to this country for a better opportunity. And right now we're starting to see that, particularly at the southwest border, where individuals are paying an upward of $5,000 to $10,000 to come into the United States to be smuggled here. And then once they get smuggled here, it doesn't mean they can't be trafficked once they're here, because now they're in debt bondage, and now they owe this money to the trafficker. So what are some of the push and pull factors that we look at? So poverty is certainly one of them. I mean, it's 2022. Poverty shouldn't even exist anymore. But poverty certainly is a factor that can push or pull somebody into trafficking. Grooming, particularly when we look at online grooming and grooming these children into false pretenses. Substance abuse. A lot of times these individuals do have some sort of substance abuse problems, or they will have a substance abuse problem throughout the course of their time that they're being in captivity or being trafficked, right? Um, Hey, somebody that might be on here has got an open mic because I'm getting a lot of feedback, so you may want to mute your microphone. So abusive and neglective homes. A lot of these, particularly from an adolescent point of view, children come from homes where they are abusive, they're neglective, which then forces them to run away, or they're entered into the foster care system, or they're homeless. These factors really elevate the risk of someone feeding the funnel into trafficking. When we talk about what's some of the pathways that these individuals become victims, abductions, like we said, they're extremely rare. The online grooming is on the rise. The advent of more and more children spending time online, we're starting to see them become easier targets for traffickers. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Meeting traffickers advertising for modeling jobs. A lot of times these traffickers will have legitimate websites that look and appear to be like a modeling agency. And they'll look for girls online through social media forums and look for those particularly that might be insecure about themselves, and comment them and compliment to them how beautiful they are. They should be a model. Here, check out my website. and then they'll lure them into that, only to feed them into the trafficking funnel. Respond to ads to work abroad, smuggling into the country, dysfunctional family relationships, maybe domestic violence at home, sexual abuse, neglect, runaway homeless, those who might have psychological or emotional difficulties, and those who might have a history of drug or alcohol abuse. I had interviewed a girl one time, and I asked her, I was like, Alice, have you always been addicted to heroin? And she said, no, Rich. She goes, I became addicted to heroin as a means to cope with being trafficked. She goes, a girl that was being trafficked with me gave me some heroin and said, here, use this. It'll help you get through the day. And she goes, all I wanted to do was get through my day. I just wanted to close my eyes and my day to be over, knowing it was just going to happen again tomorrow. But the drugs allowed me the opportunity to cope with that issue, to cope with my day and get through it. And that's how I became addicted. So then I was not only, with my trafficker because he was forcing me to be with him, I was also dependent upon him from a chemical dependency of the heroin. So when we look at sex trafficking, where is it? Because people are like, where is sex trafficking in the U.S.? I mean, victims are not walking around with a T-shirt on that says, I'm a trafficking victim. Okay, it's a very clandestine crime. But if you look for it, it's easily found. We see it in escort services, the internet, hotel, motel, massage parlors, brothels, Airbnbs. One of the trends we're starting to see now is traffickers actually renting Airbnbs. And then they'll bring girls in, they'll prostitute them out, and then the next day they're gone, which makes it extremely difficult for law enforcement to locate and identify what they're using as a means to facilitate the prostitution of these girls. So the internet, how do you police the internet? Well, let's just look at some of the things on here. So a few years ago, Backpage, which is much like Craigslist, if those of you are not familiar with it, was a site where you could buy a chair, you could buy so you could have somebody come mow your yard, or you could purchase sex. And the government shut down this website. They shut down Backpage because it was being used for this. So the site was actually out of Arizona. Well, remember, it's $150 billion a year business. So they just reopened it in what they call ebackpage.com. And now you can still use this to facilitate escort service or commercial sex. Another one that we look at too is body rubs maps. We know that there are over 25,000 illicit massage parlors across the U.S. Body Rubs Maps is a site that you can go to, and if you look down on the right-hand corner, you'll see that I just pulled this up today, to show that it is active site, and you can search by state and by city. So, just as an example, today I went in and I hit Florida, I did the Miami area, and when I did, this is what I found. So you can see the advertisements on here clearly. Where they are, they go on for days. You can just see thousands and thousands of postings. And then when you click on one of them, it takes you to this website, which I hope everyone that looks at it knows it. This is not a legitimate massage parlor, clearly, when you click that on. So you're like, well, where is this at? Well, being, prior law enforcement, I use the super secret database that everybody uses called Google. You just put the telephone number and it tells you right where it goes to. It goes right to this massage parlor on, Southwest 8th Street in Miami. So escort services, Miami, there are 14 million hits. Wow. For escort services just in Miami. How do you police the internet? That's extremely difficult. There's not enough people to do that. So when people are like, why aren't they just going through here and finding these sites and then going and arresting people? So when we look at human trafficking, it's not a problem we're going to be able to arrest our way out of when we look at it. So human trafficking in other forms, we know that labor exploitation. So where does it exist when we look from a labor standpoint? We got factories, we got migrant agriculture work, which in Florida has a huge problem with migrant agriculture work being labor exploited, exotic dancing, magazine sales, restaurant work, construction and landscaping, food processing, and then we look at the domestic work, such as housekeepers. So I have this case study up here just to tell you a little bit about this lady named Lou Kazan. Lou Kazan was She was a 78-year-old female who came to the United States from another country to become a nanny. She answered a job ad to be a nanny. And she was a nanny for this family with 3 kids. And after the kids left, the family kept her there anyway and made her do domestic work around the house. She slept on the floor in the garage on a sheet. She had only got to eat the scraps that were left over after dinner. When I say the scraps that were left over after dinner, I don't mean what everyone else didn't eat. I meant what was left on their plates that they didn't eat, the scraps. She had been to the hospital on multiple occasions and had gone unrecognized. The one time she fainted and they took her to the hospital, the nurse had received human trafficking training. She recognized the fact that she had vertigo, she was malnourished, and she had some other health problems. She was 78 years old, and she had been a domestic slave for 37 years. We were able to work with federal law enforcement and rescue her. She is now living in an assisted living home. But how do you give back someone 37 years of their life? So when we talk about trafficking, it goes well beyond just the sexual exploitation of people. This woman's dignity was taken from her. Her life was taken from her. Nearly 40 years of her life as a domestic slave. So when we look at some of the signs, what do we look for? What do you look for when you're out there? Certainly people who avoid contact with you, as a patron or with their employers. They're often very fearful because they're being controlled by their employer. They're not in control of their own documents. They got a lot of untreated injuries. They're malnourished, fatigued. When I say untreated injuries, they'll probably have an injury that they didn't go to the hospital because their trafficker's not going to take them to the hospital. So they just kind of treated it on their own. Then we look at, they don't have a vehicle, lack of transportation. A lot of times you'll see these individuals where the trafficker will actually transport these individuals from the residence of where they are staying to their place of work. And then subsequently, at the end of the day or night or whatever, they'll transport them back. So they control their movements, right? And this is how, by doing this, by transporting them back and forth, they control their movements. They're commonly wearing dirty clothes or the same clothes repeatedly. They're unaware of what city they're in. Often they don't speak the language and they don't understand the laws that are here. So when we look at it, we look at some of these signs that you may want to see that these individuals exhibit. There are several that you can see, but I always tell people, when you look at these indicators, understand it's like making a chocolate cake. Cocoa doesn't make a chocolate cake. Flour doesn't make a chocolate cake. Oil doesn't make a chocolate cake. Eggs doesn't make a chocolate cake. But when you start adding all of these ingredients together, certainly we start to see a cake develop. So when we start adding these indicators together, you certainly see the risk factor that this person is potentially being trafficked. A lot of times individuals are fearful of police or fearful of authority figures. And they are fearful of law enforcement because maybe in the country they came from, the police might have been corrupt. They didn't have a good relationship with law enforcement, or maybe the community that they come from in the United States, they didn't have a good relationship with law enforcement, or they were fearful that they were going to be arrested for drug use or participating in crimes that the trafficker made them participate in, or maybe they're just unaware of the laws that are out there that can help them, right? Fearful of their traffickers, very poor living conditions, limited clothing, disheveled, appearance. Obviously, the language barriers are huge because not knowing the language, they often may not know the laws that come with it. So, I have this story here with this individual who was actually recruited by an individual who was he was from Nicaragua, and so was the trafficker. The trafficker had went back to Nicaragua from the United States and recruited several young men from the village that he was in or grew up in, and brought them back to the United States to work for him as a day laborer in his construction. And he worked these individuals 7 days a week, typically 16 hours a day. And he transported them to and from work. They lived in a home that he owned, and he did pay them. So remember at the very beginning, just because you're paid doesn't mean you're not being trafficked, right? So he did pay them. But at the end of the week, he deducted from their paycheck their transportation to and from work, their residential accommodations, their housing. He charged them $35 a week to use the washer, $35 a week to use the dryer, hence why they had dirty clothes on. He charged them to use an outlet to plug in their cell phone. He charged them to use the refrigerator. Everything came at a cost. And at the end of the week, he didn't have any money left because the trafficker took it all back from him. And one day he had, he was so tired and so fatigued from working 7 days a week, 16 hours a day, that he sawed off his thumb. The trafficker took him to the hospital and told him, here, if you contact police, I will kill your family in Nicaragua. I know where they live. Don't forget that. You're no good to me anymore because you can't work. And he kicked him out of the van in front of the hospital. So obviously he didn't want to cooperate with law enforcement because he didn't want his family killed. So when we talk about the complexity of human trafficking, understand that this is a clandestine crime. These individuals are isolated from the rest of the world. The trafficker tries to keep them isolated, whether it's sex or whether it's labor or domestic servitude. They try to keep the victims underground or as invisible as possible as they can. So knowing what vulnerabilities exist help us better identify the victims. And most of the time I hear from people say, why don't they just leave? Why don't they just walk away from the situation? And it's easy for us to say that because we're not in that situation. But remember, we talked about a distrust of law enforcement. Maybe they're brainwashed to fear law enforcement by their pimp or their trafficker, right? They're kept in isolation. Obviously, they're not allowing them to join social media apps. They're not allowing them to communicate with their family or friends, right? False promises, lies, deceit, hopelessness. Sometimes these victims just basically feel hopeless. They just, are just in a position where they were, they've just given up, right? A lot of them are have a lack of knowledge of what's available to them, what social services are available so that they can actually be saved from this, right? Self-blame, they feel like they put themselves in a situation on their own. Maybe this is the life I deserve. This is all I have, right? They're dependent upon this trafficker because they've been with them for years. They don't know anything else. And then they become chemically dependent upon them because of the drugs. They're in debt bondage. They owe them a great deal of money. They can't pay it off, right? Social barriers, unfamiliar with laws that are out there, and they have no identification. So earlier we talked about what a trafficker does to control their victims. And we talked about the statute of force, fraud, and coercion. And we talked about compelling someone to engage in commercial sex acts or compelling them to engage in forced labor through the use of force, fraud, and coercion. Okay, that's trafficking, right? You don't have to have all three of these elements for it to be trafficking. You can have one of the three. Okay, so what is force, right? And it simply says, physical assault, forced rape, confinement, starvation, forced substance abuse. Traffickers want to get their victims addicted to narcotics because then they can force them to stay in the situation because they become dependent upon them. Fraud. Sometimes traffickers, what we call the Romeo pimp, he will lure them into a false sense of security that he loves them. He's in a relationship with them. If you love me, you will do this. Promise them a better life, right? And then coercion, obviously the psychological intimidation, the threats of harm to them or their loved ones. If you don't do this, I'll go kill your parents. You continue to do this for me or your family's dead, right? Taking all their documentation, particularly if they are of foreign born coming to the U.S. We have to be concerned about that. So what red flags are we looking for when we talk about this? So some of the key things are these individuals are very fearful and depressed. I mean, who wouldn't be if you're a modern day slave, right? You're fearful and depressed, submissive, very tense and nervous and paranoid, constantly looking around, constantly in fear of everything, very anxious, particularly if you try to talk to them or engage in conversation with them. They may be very silent or exhibit some resistance to care. And I know when we go out to the streets and try to interview individuals who we believe might be victims of forced prostitution and victims of human trafficking, we will ask them if there's anything we can do for them. They're like, no, well, I'm good, I'm fine, and then has the addiction of opioids or drug use. some of the industries that you would look in is providing commercial sex acts. You know, a lot of times we have to re-educate individuals who might think to themselves, oh, they're not a victim of human trafficking. They're just a prostitute. You know, remember paid or paid very little. We talked about that. Works excessively long hours. And why wouldn't the trafficker or the pimp have them work excessively long hours? Their labor is free. The more they can, the more times they sell that person during a 24-hour period, then the more money they make off them. It's a $150 billion a year business. Right, they owe a large debt, unable to pay it off. The individual that I told you talked about a little while ago, Jono from Nicaragua. You know, he was required. Mr. Lopez required him to work to pay off a debt because when he got to the United States, he goes, "I paid for your transportation to get here. So aside from having to pay me to live at this residence, you also have to slowly pay back the debt that you owe me for me bringing you to the United States." We see this also too in the illicit massage parlors when they're bringing these girls over from other countries to work in these massage parlors. They're requiring them to pay off a debt to be there as well. So those of you on here who might have teenagers, you know what a scripted response is. You know when your teenager's lying to you, right? Because when you ask them a question and they give you the answer, you think to yourself, "Wait a minute, that sounds too well rehearsed." And it's the same way with trafficking victims. You know, the pimp or the trafficker will tell them, "Hey, if somebody asks you this is what you tell them. Okay, this is what you say to them." So they often have scripted responses. They attempt to, just like domestic violence victims, they will attempt to reason away any bruises or marks that they may have on them. I fell down, or I did it myself, or what have you. And then tattoos and branding. I'm not saying everyone has a tattoos trafficking victim. Not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that tattoos and branding signs that might be unusual. Okay. So, for example, it's a psychological as well as a physical means for the trafficker to control the young girl, because it is a brand, and what they are doing is they are branding that individual like you would a cattle or a farm animal, and showing them that you now own them. I own you. So it gets into the head of the person that's being trafficked that they are now a piece of property. And you know, these tattoos will seem a little bit uncommon for someone to have. So where are we going? What trends are we seeing in trafficking? And it is very concerning, you know, doing the research on this, you know, the live streaming of sexual exploitation. Where are we headed, particularly in the advent of the internet and the social media platforms that exist right now, and the ones that will probably be invented by the end of this presentation. So we know that the COVID-19 pandemic made individuals more vulnerable to labor and sex trafficking, particularly online exploitation. And we know that a large amount of young adults started using social media and the internet even more. The one thing about it is that'll never go back to normal, because you don't just say, all right, you're on the internet 90% of the time. Now you got to go back to 70% of the time. That's just not the case. How many young adults have you seen walking down the street looking down at their phone? Wherever they go, they're looking at their phone. Okay. So with more and more kids being isolated from social services, from school, from after school programs, from everything else, we're starting to see them become increasingly more vulnerable to online predators. And I interviewed a guy one time who was on a study that I was doing in jail, and he was a trafficker, but he also was, you know, would lure girls online exploitation. And he said, you know, Rich, before COVID happened, you know, I would get on these, I would create a dialogue, and I would cut and paste it and put it into numerous texts for different social media platforms. I'd send out about 100, and I'd probably get about 20 to 30% response rate. And during COVID, I was getting about an 80% response rate. And he goes, in fact, I couldn't even keep up with the conversations. We had so many chat boxes open, talking to all these different kids online. And he goes, it just made it easier and easier for me. He said it was like shooting fish in a barrel, is what he said to me. I was like, wow. And he goes, it's made it so much easier. We know that the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children said that the reports during the pandemic doubled. And so look at this. During 2020, there was more than 21.7 million reports to NCMEC. NCMEC is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, to their cyber tip line. Almost 22 million reports of child sexual exploitation. That is just crazy when you look at the numbers and you think about it. 1.5 billion students worldwide were impacted by school closures. So you think the individuals that they were talking to while they were at home, they're no longer talking to now if they went back to school? Because that's not the case. They continually are. These traffickers have taken advantage of you spending more and more time online, particularly online that's unsupervised, and they are looking to exploit these children. 90% of those in online sexual abuse are females. And we do know that 55% of sex trafficking victims in the U.S. met their trafficker online. 55%. I was giving a lecture at a school district right outside of Washington, D.C. this past year. And so it was roughly about 2,500 children in there, high school students. And I asked them, I said, how many of you have ever talked to somebody online that you have or did not know? And everybody in the room raised their hand. I said, okay, how many of you have met somebody online and then later met that person in person that you did not know before? And about half the room raised their hand. So over half of these kids met a person online they did not know before, and then their next meeting was with them in person. That's pretty scary to me, particularly. So what pushes and pulls these kids into this? We know that a lot of the push factors, the children who may have been victims of sexual abuse at home or from a relative or family friend, and have some emotional abuse issue. Maybe children who are from homes where domestic violence is a common feature in the home. Maybe parents have a high level of vulnerability with their drug or alcohol or mental illness or learning disability, disrupted family life, obviously. Parenting or lack thereof is what I like to call it. Lack thereof, particularly these young individuals who might be insecure, who may be looking for a little bit more than they're getting attention-wise, and children who might have some learning impairments or physical impairments. And some of the factors that pull them is, these kids like the fact that they're being liked by an older male or an older person, right, online. That's intriguing to them. That a stranger wants to know more about them. Meeting someone who thinks they're special. These traffickers are not just out there and not doing their homework. They're cruising the internet looking for people who are of the utmost vulnerability, right? And they're looking for those that they can easily take advantage of. Remember, we talked about the common denominator to trafficking being those who are most vulnerable. And that's what those traffickers look for, right? So this live streaming sexual abuse is becoming a huge trend now. Individuals being trafficked online without the trafficker having any physical contact with them. They are getting these young, particularly we see this with the young female community, where they're getting these girls to exchange photographs with them online. And then they are sextorting them. They are using that to extort them. And we're calling that sextortion. They're using that to say, hey, look, you either send me some more pictures, or I'm going to send this to your parents, or I'll send it to your friends or your school, or I'll upload it to the internet. And then, this right here is an example of a girl who's 14 years of age, and this individual convinced her to do a strip show on an online forum. And then he sold seats to men around the world to watch her engage in an online strip show, while her parents thought she was actually upstairs doing her homework. And we're starting to see this as an emerging trend. As a parent myself, this is scary to think that this happens. And we know that 40% of these cases do not even get reported to law enforcement. And typically these children do not report that this has even happened to their parents for a period of almost 2 years. So there's 2 years that go through a time where they're being exploited by somebody, and they're just too scared to say anything to their parents about it. And this is a case that I actually worked right before Christmas. It was December 21st. I'd gotten a call from a concerned parent that she had found out that her daughter was communicating with a boy, and that she met online. And she looked through her phone and she found some explicit photographs that had been exchanged between the two of them. So I interviewed her and I interviewed her daughter, and I looked at the phone. And so she initially met this guy in what they call Virtual Quest, which is a virtual reality game system where you can go into these different gaming platforms and play games with other people. So she met him there. He told her he was 14 years of age, said he was from England, from the United Kingdom. She met him there, and then they went to another game and played another game there. Then this conversation evolved from the gaming platform to Snapchat, and then it evolved from Snapchat to text messaging, and then it evolved from that to phone calls. And how the mother found out is he then started wanting to do FaceTime with the girl. And going through her deleted text messages, you could see that he simply was grooming her, because he was saying, delete our messages, delete the photographs so nobody sees them. They wouldn't understand our relationship. They wouldn't understand what's going on. So long story short, through the course of this investigation, I found out that this individual was not in the UK. He was actually in the United States. And he was not 14 years of age. He was actually 44 years of age. And during the course of his background investigation, there was about a 15-year gap where he was kind of just off the grid. And being former law enforcement, I know if you're off the grid for a period of time, you're either overseas serving in the military or you're in prison. And this guy just got out of jail for kidnapping. He did a 15-year stint. So this young girl was actually talking to a 44-year-old felon who just got out of jail for kidnapping. And thank goodness the mother kind of recognized some signs in her daughter that led her to kind of go, you know what, something's not right here. And we'll talk a little bit about that in here as well. So what are some indicators that we should be concerned about is, fathers, mothers, grandparents, aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, what should we be concerned about here? Trauma, distress in your child, maybe an unusual behavior, secretive behavior, always being secret. Who you talking to? Nobody. Who is that? No, nobody. You wouldn't know him. In fact, that's what, Alice said. Alice, her mom asked who this person was, and she goes, oh, just a friend from school. You wouldn't know him. Okay. Isolating themselves, like going into the bathroom a lot with their phone and closing the door, going into their room a lot and closing the door, but constantly on their phones, very non-communicative with those. So typically we look for that change in behavior. What's not normal, right? And then this is just basic 101. Clearing their internet history. No one should be clearing their internet history unless they're looking at stuff they shouldn't be looking at. So it's a concern when you look at your child's internet history and it's not there. So changes in their body language, such as avoiding eye contact with you. And this is going to be quite typical for a teenager because they're embarrassed. And even though they think you don't know what's going on, they're still not going to look at you. So they'll look away from you. Having a much older boyfriend or girlfriend, that's certainly a red flag. And then maybe some signs of erratic behavior, and that's typical, the erratic behavior. And, why are we so concerned with the online recruitment? Because, the accessibility and, and the internet is easily accessible. You can remain anonymous. That's on there. Obviously, this guy said he was 14 years of age, but he was not 14. He was 44. Some of the apps allow you to delete the messages, or they just disappear altogether. The traffickers will use multiple communication devices to basically to talk to these young adults online to try to groom them. Social media allows them to pretty much control their victims from a remote stance. Remember, we talked about using as a means of sextortion, particularly when they have a means to extort their victims through photographs or videos that they might have. And then the traffickers make it make it easy to identify their victims just by going through and looking for their patterns of behavior, looking at the victims online and their accessibility, but also their vulnerability. Those particularly that might be isolated, those who are looking for attention, those who are insecure, etc. And, here's some apps that you can kind of be concerned about on here. I mean, a couple of these are dating apps. I mean, if you have a teenage kid and they're on Plenty of Fish, or Grinder, some of these, or Bumble, these are dating apps. They shouldn't be on those. So it's a big concern on those. Snapchat, TikTok, yeah, they might seem as innocent as they are, but they're actually, certainly a platform that traffickers definitely use to communicate and to groom these individuals that are online. So these are things to look for, on kids' phone, and just be aware, have a heightened sense of awareness when we look at that. Obviously they're like, well, what should we do? Who should I call? And I always tell people that, like, look at this. So it's better to say something and be wrong than not have said something and had been right, because that's just one more day that person has to live in exploitation, right? So obviously, if it's of immediate concern, contact 911, right? Always contact 911. You can contact Homeland Security, National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is on there. You can contact Hope for Justice, us. We have, investigators, all of our investigative hubs are retired law enforcement, and they're all licensed private investigators, and we work investigations alongside law enforcement. We know that their resources are thin, so we work cases up to a point where we pass them off to prosecutors for prosecution, or we pass them off to law enforcement for further investigation. But oftentimes we try to fill that gap that they're there. So basically, prevention, preventing exploitation, rescuing these victims that are out there, because they're out there, restoring lives and reforming society. Rescuing someone is not the end of the event. Trafficking victims have such severe trauma that you have to really kind of restore their lives back to normal when we look at that. And you know, well, certainly we can look at just from the simplistic point of demographics and the sheer number of people that are there. But then also too, let's dig into some of the vulnerabilities that are there. There are more ethnic groups in New York City than any other city in the United States, right? So when we look at these individuals come to the United States, they may come here and they may not have the knowledge of what laws are available, what social services are available to them, and they could have been exploited along the way to get here to the United States. Then let's also start looking at the homeless community, the runaway community that's in those areas. All those funnels that feed trafficking are going to drive up the numbers in every one of those states.
Also, I wanted to ask, how can we end it? This is a modern era. Who's benefiting from human trafficking?
I know you look at it and you're like, well, wait a minute. I thought we eradicated slavery 150 years ago, but no, we didn't. And you had brought up yourself at the very beginning, there are more people enslaved now than ever before. And and that's true. It's almost baffling. I'm like, we're in 2022. How do we still have this problem in society? But it's sheer greed. It's $150 billion a year business, and it's greed that drives this. And I always tell people, I'm like, I worked counterterrorism for a great deal of time in my career, and I always thought, when I interviewed a terrorist, I thought, you're the worst person I've ever met in my entire life, until I interviewed a trafficker. And then I realized to myself, no, you are certainly the worst person. There's a special kind of hell for you, because you're willing to exploit somebody's life for sheer profit. That's just despicable for somebody to do that. But it's greed that drives this, pure greed.
Can you go into the tattooing, how handlers will tattoo their people to identify them, to mark them? Can you just really share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, most definitely. So these traffickers will use the tattoos to brand their product, so that other pimps out there will know that this girl or this boy belongs to this certain person, right? But then it's also, they use it as that control mechanism, because they put that on that person and they're like, I own you now. You are mine. You're my property. You see that name? That's me. And now I own you. So psychologically, it puts it into that girl's head that this is it. We also know that we're starting to see not so much the tattooing yet, but at the influx at the border, we're starting to see these individuals who are being smuggled into the United States wearing these wristbands that people would get when they go to Disney or wherever. And they would wear these wristbands. And when they get to the United States across the border, the cartels will know that this group wearing this wristband belongs to this certain cartel, and then they'll take them to a cartel's house in the United States, and that's where they'll start shipping them out across the country to be either labor trafficked or sex trafficked.
Also, I've just heard and been to human trafficking symposiums and workshops about white vans. Always be aware of these white vans going through slowly and smoothly. Is that true as well?
I think when we look at the whole myths and conspiracies around human trafficking, I saw something on TikTok somebody sent me, and it was a person held their phone over a shopping cart at Target, and it had a zip tie on it, and they said, "This is the first sign that you're going to be kidnapped and trafficked. Traffickers often put zip ties on this." And I'm like, "No, that's not true. Trafficking is really, it's a crime of opportunity for these traffickers. They target those that are most vulnerable. When we talk about the white vans, we talk about the vans that are windowless. Obviously, we see a lot of these being used, particularly in labor trafficking. We see a lot of these from transporting individuals from the house where they're staying, where the traffickers are keeping them, to the destination, which is wherever they're working them, whether it's the fields or the market or what have you. Then they use that same van to transport them back to that house. So yeah, we do see vans. I don't know particularly if that to be white, but we do use large transportation vessels in order to get people from one to another.
And could you just share some more about the recruitment strategies that these people are using to lure people to work with them?
Yeah. So when we look at it from either, let's just talk first about labor. We'll look at labor trafficking. So we worked this in this investigation, and it was an individual. She was a Polish national, married to an American in the U.S. She went back to visit family. And there was a person from her community there that was asking her about the United States. And she says, "You should come over to the United States. You could come with me. In fact, you could my husband would employ you and you could work for us." And he, obviously didn't speak the language. And he said, "Sure." So he came back to the United States with her, and her husband forced him to do domestic work, to do labor around their house, basically just forced him into domestic servitude around their house. And he didn't speak the language, didn't know the laws. Then they convinced him to stay because they said, "You've overstayed your visa. If you leave here, you'll get arrested." They never paid him. And fortunate enough, he was able to get his hands on a cell phone and contacted his brother overseas, told him what was happening, and then we were able to get him rescued. But he was lured over here under the false promise. Things were so bad for him where he was. He had no money, he had no economic opportunity, and he was lured here under false promises. That's easy. Now, when we talk about the sex trafficking, there's so many different avenues that these individuals are being lured into the sex trade, because nobody is raising their hand, Jay, and going, "Hey, can you get me into the field of sexual exploitation?" That's just not the case. These individuals are being groomed either online through various means, or these might be individuals who are runaways, who are down on their luck, they're homeless. We know that traffickers and pimps actually cruise the runaway shelters. They go to these runaway shelters and engage these individuals, and they're like, "Do you like sleeping here at the runaway shelter? You don't? Well, I have a house that you could stay in. Do you want to come stay with me? You can stay and hang out with me." And then when they get there to that house, it may be a couple nights of paradise for them, and then the next night they're raped, and then they're forced into prostitution, and then they're threatened that if you leave this situation, I'll kill you.
I'm sorry about that. Now, one of the things what message can we give to parents for their children? We know men and women are affected. No one is excluded. But for parents, how can parents be assured or teach their children what to look out for, the signs? And
Children, all of us know that children are inherently naive, and they don't think of the dangers that we think of as adults, because we think of these dangers based on our experiences, our life experiences. We base our knowledge on what we see on the news, what we read, what we're told, what we hear. So we know that there are inherent dangers that lie out there. We also know that there are people who are inherently evil that exist out there. So it goes beyond just being paranoid, but it goes to like educate our kids. Like, hey, look, here's the thing. It's kind of like, at what age do you talk to them about the birds and the bees? It's the same thing. Sometimes you have to have that hard conversation with your kid that, hey, there are people out there who are inherently evil, and this is kind of what you need to look for. You need to look for somebody. Are you talking to somebody online that you shouldn't be talking to? Has somebody approached you online? I mean, there's a lot of different things on there that it means, but communicate, educate these kids. They need to know it.
So who should the children call? What should they do if they encounter something like this and they're able to break away? What are some steps that they can take to protect themselves and to also identify those who might be in that line of work?
I think the key is, doing what you guys are doing today, raising this level of awareness, taking it to the community, educating the community so they're aware of what's going on, but also educating these children. We need to get this type of awareness training in the schools, in the churches, in with youth groups, in with community groups, so that people are better educated on this. I once had a girl who was in a trafficking situation who purposely went into a dollar store and stole something just so she could get arrested, just so she could get away from her trafficker. And a lot of times these individuals who are in a trafficking situation may not know that there are laws out there that protect them. They're a victim. Okay, they've done nothing wrong. They've been forced into doing this. And so we need to educate them that there are ways to get out of this, and you can clear your history, your criminal history, and you can make a better life for yourself. This doesn't have to be your life.
So how often does that happen on a percentage? How many people actually figure out ways to escape, to emancipate themselves?
Not enough. Not enough. Most of these individuals who are in a trafficking situation never make it out of that situation because they go unidentified. They'll either die of overdose or they'll die of just health situations or issues like that. There was this one girl that we had rescued who was being trafficked by an individual. We found her in the hospital. She had cut her face, and the trafficker told her she was no good to him anymore. So he threw her out the back of his car while he was driving 60 miles an hour down the road, and she just bounced like a ball on the interstate. Laid there on the side of the road for a day before somebody found her, and she was in the hospital and almost died. And that's what he was trying to do, was kill her. These girls, these boys, these men, these women, they are a piece of property to these traffickers. And once they become unuseful to them, then they become a burden, and they no longer need them. And they don't want them to be alive when they leave them, because what we start to see is a lot of these individuals just overdosing on themselves because the pimp will give them something just to get rid of them.
Okay, we have another team member by the name of Rochelle. She has a question for you, and she's going to ask you that question at this time, Doc.
Yeah.
Dr. Richard, we had a question. We wanted to know, what was the life expectancy of some of these children or women within the sexual trafficking or human trafficking business?
Well, Doc, just in case while she's getting her questions together or trying to connect, we're just looking at are there any funds set up, any type of things that we could donate to, or we can go where we help these people that in need.
Young girls
okay, here she is.
Are expected to live through this.
Hey, Chriselle, I'm sorry, I didn't get your full question. Do you mind repeating it for me, please?
I'm sorry. Can you hear me? Are we having any connection problems?
Yep.
Sorry
no, I hear
about
you
that. We were asking about the life expectancy of some of these women and young girls within the sexual trafficking business. How long are they expected to live, or what do you see as their lifespan throughout this whole situation?
Those who go unrescued under 10 years, typically between 5 and 10. We're looking at individuals who are malnourished, who are not getting enough rest, not getting enough sleep, untreated injuries, forced use of drugs and alcohol, and then just continued abuse. So even those who get rescued have a long road to recovery, particularly when we look at individuals and the trauma that they've been through. We often talk about how trafficking victims are unique in the fact that they suffer the whole spectrum of trauma. They have the alcohol abuse, they have the substance abuse, they have the physical abuse, the sexual abuse, the emotional abuse, the psychological abuse. They run that whole rainbow. And that's very difficult for someone to overcome when you think about struggling with trauma and the sheer post-traumatic stress from that trauma.
passed on as born into that whole lifestyle that they become slaves, or do they give them up for adoption? What happens generally?
Yes, there have been situations, both, that these individuals are either given up for adoption, and most of the time that's the case. A lot of times, the babies are given up in a safe, what we call the safe act, where they take the child either to the hospital, or they'll take them to the fire department, or take them to the police station. They'll drop them off, no questions asked. A lot of times they're given away, and sometimes they're even sold. So, there's a real hard statistic on that just runs the gamut. And a lot of times, traffickers will just take the female into the hospital and get them to get an abortion. Because keep in mind, this is a product that he can no longer use now that she's pregnant.
We had another question.
And what?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead, Jay. We had another question. So as far as Purity, we do have the opportunity where we are around some of that vulnerable population, the dysfunctional families, and we wanted to know what are some strategies that we can use when we are confronted with some of these young people that definitely tell us about their home lives, or they share some of the issues that they may be having at home. What should we do to at least help them make better choices? Some of them will discuss that they're looking for that family. I know that some of us have been exposed to some of these young people that get into this lifestyle because they're looking for that support, they're looking for that family, and whether it's pimping or whether it's the prostitution, they're able to almost find that family atmosphere from that. So what can we do to counteract that?
Yeah, it's unfortunate when we look at the development of children and the exposure that the home life either provides them or does not provide them. And we know that when we look at like trafficking or delinquency or any of this, the key element is starting with the home life. And I said earlier, parenting or lack thereof. And a lot of times, we're starting to see, half the society today is divorced. So we're starting to see, a number of single family homes, single parent homes. And when we look at single parent homes, that whether it's a mother or a father taking care of these children, they're often working jobs, or hardly they're not at home. You've got a lot of children that have a lot of time issues. Maybe they're hanging around the peer crowd. Maybe they're filling the gap after time with drugs or alcohol, or maybe they're being sexually abused at home. And we look at it kind of like we do an illness. How do you end this illness? Well, you treat it with either therapy or medicine, right? And you try to do that. So same way when we look at these children who are exposed to these types of things that raise or elevate their risk factors of them either going into the juvenile track or going into the being prostituted or trafficked out. Remember, if you're under the age 18, there's no such thing as child prostitution. It's trafficking because the child can't give consent. So the key is providing them with those social services that exist. And it's important for us to understand that there's a lot of great nonprofits that are out there. There's a lot of great community engagement groups offered whether through the church or whether through the community or both. And providing those kids who are at risk another alternative to what they could be doing that might not be the right thing to do, and engage them properly. Obviously, if the child's being sexually exploited at home, seriously. We need to contact Department of Children's Services, and then also to law enforcement if it's ever suspected that that's the case, because we're required to do that by law. But I think that knowing what available services outside of the educational institution that's available that you can refer these kids to.
Also, there was another question that came in, but I missed it. We need to get down to the last question because we want to turn this back over to Laldi. But just wanted to ask you about the Romeo and the gorilla pimping. Can you just explain that, please?
When we look at that, we see these two different scenarios of the Romeo pimp and the gorilla pimp. The Romeo pimp is categorized as the type of person that's gonna romance their victim. I love you, I care about you, we're a couple, we're together, you're my girl, I love you. And then forces them into prostitution because of the fact that, like, hey, if you love me, you'll do this. Okay. If you really care about me, you'll do this. I love you. Please do this for me. I want you to do this for me. So, which is completely opposite when we look at the gorilla pimp, because the gorilla pimp is one who basically forces the female or male into prostitution through threats of force or intimidation. And I've seen that multiple times where these individuals will beat these girls to a point where they're so scared and intimidated by this individual that they'll easily prostitute themselves out or traffic themselves because they don't want to take another beating. And so it's unfortunate that we even have to have this conversation about this.
Thank you, Doc. That's the end of my questions. I'm going to turn it back over to Laura. She may have a question or two for you, but so insightful. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, Jay, you bet. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schoeberl, for being here with us today and giving us so much great information. I feel a lot more empowered as a leader, and I hope that our audience that have been listening today, parents as well as other leaders within the church and our community, that you have gained quite a bit of knowledge this afternoon about this critical topic on human trafficking. By far, I know there's so much other questions that we probably can entertain today, but this is by far not the last time that we will be having this discussion. We do plan to have some further discussions and platforms and forums discussing this, and we would love to have you join us again, Dr. Schoeberl, to do a follow-up on this critical conversation. Thank you, Jay Rolle, for helping us today with moderating this program as well. At this time, we're going to bring our program to close, and before we do that, we are going to have Pastor Doughton give us a wrap-up for this evening. Thank you, and stay tuned.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, for joining in this great discussion. Dr. Richard, we want to thank you. Jay Rolle, we thank you so much for being part of this discussion and sharing in your knowledge and expertise. I want to just turn your attention to the Bible for a moment, and I'm looking at Genesis chapter 37, verses 26 to 28. And here it just highlights the story of Joseph that we know so well. And in that, Joseph is taken by his brothers and trafficked. Now, this is not a new issue. It has been in the Bible, and we have known the stories, but maybe we haven't looked at it from that aspect. But Joseph is trafficked, sent down to Egypt, and becomes one of those individuals, a young person who is led into this life by individuals who should have cared for him. And Joseph spends his entire life into an area that many of us wish none of our children would ever enter. And he gets into the house of a man whose name is Potiphar. And even his wife is trying to now lead him down into being trafficked sexually. And it's just sad when we look at the story from that aspect of being trafficked. Joseph is that example. And one thing that stands out for me, in spite of all that he has encountered, is in Genesis chapter 39. And 3 times in that passage, the Bible says that God was with him. Now, it may seem like a dark place for those who are trafficked, for those who are going through some very terrible and unimaginable times. But one thing is for sure, God has not abandoned you. And in the same way, we're told in the Word that he did not abandon Joseph. The good thing about it, Joseph comes out of being trafficked, and he's led by God into an area of leadership. Not only that, as he gets older, we see that Joseph's life changes, and Joseph now has this experience where he goes back and he's able to save the lives of many others. It is my prayer today that those who have experienced this tragic and cruel form of punishment in this life, that as God does something wonderful for you and free you from that area of hurt and pain, that you will turn back and you will free others who are enslaved in this cruel form of punishment. My prayer for you today is that you will find that freedom that comes with Christ, and that God will intervene in your situation, and God will be with you like he was with Joseph, and you will see that throughout the pain and the anguish that you have gone through in your life, that you can rest assured to say this testimony like Joseph has experienced: God was with me. Let's pray today. Father in heaven, Lord, I pray today, oh God, that you will continue to speak to the hearts of those who encounter this message this evening. Lord, I pray for those who have experienced different forms of trafficking, that they will find that freedom that rests only in you, that resides in you. Lord, I pray today that you will continue to use Pure Reality, that as we continue, oh God, to spread this message, that many lives will be touched, and we'll find that you are the one leading our lives. So we thank you again for those who have given their time and their energy and their effort in being able to draw our awareness to this very critical issue today. So bless us, oh God. Be with our families. Protect our children. And at the end, oh God, may your name be praised. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you so much for joining us today for another Pure Reality event. And we ask you to please subscribe to our YouTube channel as well as our Facebook page as well. And we ask that you also subscribe to our website, which is purereality.org, and YouTube .purereality.c/c for our YouTube page for those of you that did not join us that way, and again on our Facebook page. So